Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Ailie Elmore. She is a woman who wears many hats. She teaches at the University of Illinois. She works at Servant Financial, and then also does a little bit of writing for us at Farmers Risk. So glad you had the chance to sit down and take some time. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So first, let's just kind of start from the top. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of your background? And I know you went to U of I, which is my alma mater as well. Kind of what led you up to the university?
Yeah, so I grew up on a farm in central Illinois. We grow corn and soybeans, and I, grew up working alongside my father, my grandfather, and my brother, and now I help manage things as well now that I'm older. And so agriculture has just always been a huge passion of mine. And U of I was just always, the University of Illinois was just always a natural fit. My mom got her master's here. My brother went to school here. I had several other family members that went to school here. And so this was just such a natural fit for me, one of the top agricultural programs in the country. And I always knew I was interested in finance right off the bat. My father also runs a small community bank where I'm from. And so I kind of grew up both in that farm setting and then also grew up going into the bank with him. And so finance was just always a really natural fit in agriculture finance in particular. So that's kind of what led me to end up going here. I did 2 years at community college first. I wanted to save money and I wanted to continue helping my dad on the farm. And living close to home and going to community college allowed me to do so. And then, I went to U of I and had the opportunity to get linked in with Dr. Bruce Sherrick. He's the director for the Center for Farmland Research at the university. And then he kind of led me to end up coming back here to get my master's degree. I finished up my master's in applied economics last year, specializing in ag finance, and I ended up getting to stay on as an instructor last fall. So I have been there ever since. So I kind of was one of those people that came to the University of Illinois and never really left.
Wow, very cool. Very cool. I was curious, on the community college, where'd you go? Because I actually am a community college person as well. Then I transferred up to the U of I. Same story, wanted to save money, but still wanted to go to the university, and staying home close to home and saving some money was a great benefit.
Yeah, so I went to Lincoln Land Community College. My uncle Charlie Long was one of the founding fathers of Lincoln Land Community College, and then my dad is also he heads up the board of directors at the community college now.
Wow!
So yeah, it's a very family. My entire family went there, so it just kind of made sense.
Cool. So was it always? We've talked to a few other people that have definitely grown up on farms, and they want to go back or they want to work in ag or something like that. And that seems like that was always the case in their life. Just growing up, you're just always in it. But the finance aspect, did that hit you at one point that you can remember in your life, such as, I went into the bank with my dad in 5th grade and we looked over some things and I got a free sucker, or was it maybe later on in life?
Honestly, I kind of knew I always just wanted to be like my dad growing up. I grew up with him taking me into the bank, and I would sit in the corner and play with a tractor while he met with a farmer when I was 5 years old, and would run around the bank and eat suckers and whatever other treats that the tellers would give me. And then I ended up working as a teller right after my senior year of high school while I was in community college. And I just really liked that human connectivity aspect. And, when it comes to finance, personal finance in particular is just such a, what's the right word I'm looking for? It's such a way to connect with people, and it's such a personal thing for other people. And so being able to connect with others about their finances and about money. And, growing up, I just loved to play with money. I loved, the feel of it. I got to count the rolls of quarters and the vault and things like that. And so it was just always kind of a natural fit. I just always knew that's what I was going to do.
Very cool. Very cool. So then you went to the U of I and you specialized, you went to the College of Aces, but specialized in ag finance, or? Okay.
Yep. Yeah, so I got my undergrad technically in agriculture and consumer economics through the department of what we call ACE. And then I specialized in finance and agribusiness.
Cool. And so you and I had a little bit different experience. I know we both took Bruce Sherrick's class. I think it was ACE 446. I went in there. I saw one 3-dimensional graph that Bruce Sherrick put on the PowerPoint slide, and I started running the opposite direction. Obviously, you leaned into that. Was that just the perfect marriage when he was kind of explaining the S&P 500, farmland, how they don't correlate, all that stuff, and it just was like, oh my gosh, I've met Nirvana. I am here.
Yeah, I mean, it started off, really loved to hear Bruce's passion about agriculture, but just investing in general. He was just so passionate and had so many like real world experiences that the students just really they just love to hear about that. He starts usually all of his classes with 10 to 15 minutes about talking about what's going on in markets. And so I just really loved that passion and really just wanted to be a part of that. When I started my master's program and we were talking about what my thesis was going to be like, I honestly thought I was going to go more on the route of, looking at like liquidity for farmers and maybe looking more on kind of taking more of a lending aspect of how, maybe talking about agriculture and interest rates or something along those terms. But then, Dr. Sherrick is the director for Farmland Research, and he asked me to update some papers and things for him. And I just got really interested in the idea that farmland is such a good hedge against inflation. And, it's this physical asset that so many people are interested in investing in. And I'm so glad I went that route because it's enabled me to be, I wouldn't call myself an expert, but a mini expert in, a topic area like that.
Well, and your thesis is the role of farmland with mixed asset investment portfolio. Correct. Can you tell us a little bit about that? If you just give a quick pitch of kind of what you did, what you worked on?
Yeah. So it's a long process. I mean, the thesis process is a long, grueling process, but I learned so much from it. So like you said, the title was the role of farmland within a mixed asset investment portfolio. So I first created my own Farmland Index. And so I created it returns to 10 different states, the 10 kind of top agriculturally producing states based on some USDA data. And I analyzed the returns from 1970 to 2020, so a 50-year investment horizon. And then I analyzed those returns against the S&P 500, treasuries, and then AAA bonds as well. And so I was able to kind of build what your optimal portfolio should be based on different risk levels or different risk return levels that you would like to have. And I was able to create my optimal portfolio of how much farmland should you actually have within your own investment portfolio. And then did some other, just a lot of background information just about, I really wanted anyone that picked up this document to be able to learn just more about farmland and more about what drives farmland values, talking about just the global need for food in our growing population. So I really wanted anyone that picked it up was able to learn a little bit more about farmland, a little bit more about agriculture as well.
Interesting. So I'd be curious. I had a cousin who actually completed his PhD at U of I it was also in ACEs, but it was plant science. And I mean, I think I didn't see him for about 2 years. I think he just went to the underground library and he just lived there for 2 years. Is there any difference between a master's thesis and a doctorate thesis? Is it length? Is it just time?
It's all of that. It's length, it's time. So I spent about a year working on my master's thesis. And even today, I still have people that are asking me questions about, well, what if you did this and you changed this factor? And so when it comes to, your dissertation for your PhD, you really are considering all of those other little factors as well. And so it's time, it's length. You really become more of an expert in that field than you do with a master's, for sure.
Interesting. So then whenever you've completed this document, this thesis, Who are you presenting this to? Obviously, you worked with Bruce Sherrick. Are you presenting it just to him? Is there more professors they bring in, and you got to kind of like Shark Tank almost pitch this, or?
Kind of, yeah. It was kind of like Shark Tank a little bit. So I had a defense committee, Gary Schnittke, who does a lot when it comes to the Farm Doc website, and then also Nick Paulson. He is both professors at the university. Nick Paulson, in particular, helped write the Farm Bill. Things like that. And so both of them were professors that I had in, multiple of my classes. And then I also had Professor Paul Stoddard, who also came in and sat in and gave his 2 cents as somebody. He used to worked in industry for 20, 30 years before he ended up coming to academia. And so he had kind of just a differing perspective as well. So yeah, it was 30, 45 minutes of me just presenting my research, and then about another hour of questions and comments and things like that. So definitely it was a grueling process, but I don't know, I got a lot out of just that defense process as well.
Very cool. So then the next step, obviously, you went to teach at the University of Illinois. I would say that's not as typical of path. I mean, kind of everybody's waiting around the career fair and at the gym and looking for a job, but you decided, hey, I want to go back and teach at the university. When was that always the case of interest, or was that kind of during that thesis process, you're like, this actually would be pretty interesting?
So how I was able, when I was in my master's program, I was a teaching assistant for Dr. Sherrick. So I was helping him TA for his investments class, and then also the Excel modeling class that you were talking about earlier. So I had the opportunity to be his TA, and I did it for 3 years. So by the 3rd year, he kind of let me take his content and run with it. So he let me lecture 5 or 6 classes by myself, and then I also was responsible for creating the homeworks and some of the midterms. And so I really, really just fell in love with the student, like interacting with students. And really, I love that moment where you see a light bulb go off in a student's head and they finally are understanding a topic that maybe took them for a while to get their understanding in. And so I really just fell in love with teaching through that. And I communicated that with Dr. Sherrick and some others. And so they kind of took a chance on me this last fall and let me, I co-taught this last fall with a couple different professors. And then this spring, I'm co-teaching a couple classes and I'm teaching a couple on my own as well. So
very cool. What are those courses?
Yeah, so I teach the investments class that Dr. Sherrick teaches in the spring. It's called Financial Services and Investment Planning. So I taught that in the fall. I also taught personal finance in the fall. And now I'm teaching personal finance again. Farm management, which I love. It's just been such a fun class. It's just such an interactive class with the students. And then also a small business finance class. These are all classes that I took in undergrad. And so I've been able to take my own experience and be able to build upon that with the students and kind of tweak things that maybe I didn't like or what I wanted more of. It's been a really great experience so far.
I'd be curious on the personal finance course. Like you said, these are all classes that I took. I've been able to tweak the curriculum a little bit for what I think is valuable. In the personal finance course, and I remember taking personal finance in high school and college, and it was like, how to write a check and all this other stuff, but which is still applicable. But do you guys dip your toes in at all, like the crypto space or the fintech space, or these discussions you guys are having now that maybe we didn't even have 4 or 5 years ago?
Yeah, so we're getting more and more students that are asking those kinds of questions. So should I be, like when GameStop was the whole GameStop thing that happened a year ago now, I had so many students that wanted to talk about GameStop or Robinhood. And now it's still, cryptos or, what are the best budgeting apps and what inflation, what's going on in the stock market. And so when it comes to personal finance in particular, I like to spend the first 5 to 10 minutes of class just like talking about what's going on in markets. And primarily I got that from listening to Dr. Sher teach for so long. And I love just spending 5 to 10 minutes of interacting with the students about, okay, what do you think about Tesla right now as a stock? Or what do you think about what's going to happen long-term prospects for the S&P 500 this year? Asking those kinds of questions, it just sparks a really interesting debate. And sometimes it ends up taking half the class. But I really think students get more out of, seeing, okay, those real world applications. There were so many classes in my undergrad that I'm like, when am I ever going to use this or ever going to see this? And so being able to connect that with the students is a really good thing. And we're also just seeing the demand for the types of courses. So we're now offering like a fintech class because people are just so interested in talking about it. And some other classes that are just more applicable to today's world.
You, on some of these topics, maybe it's the GameStops, meme stocks, maybe it's a crypto. Do you, whenever you're kind of letting the kids or the students just kind of engage in that conversation, do you step in and kind of opine, or are you like more of like a moderator and you're just listening and kind of taking this in and seeing where the conversation goes?
It depends. I like to be able to interact with the students directly and ask them questions. I just remember when I was taking Dr. Sher's class, he would always just say, okay, but why? Like constantly back to the students. Okay, but why? And really just taking people on that thought experiment and getting them to think about all of these different perspectives. However, it is really fun when you have 2 or 3 students that are all, I don't want to say battling against one another, but I remember I had two students, one that was arguing for cryptos and one that was arguing against cryptos. And they both just brought really good points to the table, things that I wouldn't even think about. I try to tell my students that I don't consider myself an expert, and I am here to also learn from you as well. I think this is a learning experience for everyone involved.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah, my wife's doing her MBA right now. And there's definitely a few students that are extremely passionate about crypto. That seems to be how it works. They're very, very passionate individuals. So
yes,
you brought up
absolutely.
You brought up inflation in that personal finance class. Obviously, a lot of folks, it's kind of on top of mind. I mean, the day we're recording this, I think they just released the Consumer Price Index.
They did, yeah.
A few hours ago. When folks think about hedging against inflation, obviously the first things that come up are, farmland, golds, metals, tips. Is there any relationship between maybe the soft commodities and inflation, maybe some of that corn and soybeans as well?
Yeah, historically, there's a lot of research done in this space, and historically, there is a correlation. There is a pretty strong correlation between those, soft commodities and inflation. However, I think there's just so many other things that are in work that are affecting that. The prices of corn and soybeans are all driven by, supply and demand, which, part of that is inflation, and then part of that is just what's going on in the world right now. We've seen that relationship kind of taper off a little bit within the last 20 years. However, it is still a fairly good hedge against inflation. The agriculture industry is traditionally just a good hedge against inflation, regardless of what's going on during the COVID-19 pandemic or what's going on, in the past when there's been, post-war inflationary periods or during war inflationary periods. The thing that, people remember is people still have to eat. Regardless of what's going on in the world, people still have to eat. And so, that it's all driven by that supply and demand factor. So yeah, I think, we've seen commodity prices be fairly high over the last year in particular, and then continuing to do so into 2022. And you see inflation's been high as well. So that relationship is holding true.
Interesting. And now the Fed, obviously, getting all these inflation numbers is wanting to combat that by, I can't remember exactly if they're going to try to do 3 or 4 rate increases this year. Yeah. I don't know I think it's still discussed if it's a quarter or a half.
Yeah.
4 to 5. Okay. Yeah. 4 to 5. So I think. Oh, carry on.
Yeah. There's a bunch of, everyone's speculating right now about what the Fed is going to do. I think more people are thinking a quarter in March, or a quarter. But some are saying a half. So it's all just really up in the air, and it's all speculation until we really know what goes on. But
Is there, now whenever I hear that as just a homeowner, maybe looking to refinance my house or purchase a house, I think, oh, that mortgage rate's going to go up higher. Maybe if you're a grower, that operating loan is going to go higher. Is there any maybe additional things that folks should keep their eye on with interest rates going up that might also, be affected?
yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it goes back to, you think about your farms that are really highly levered, and this is something that's really, people are really concerned about for those more highly levered operations. So it's really, you got to have those conversations with your lenders about, should I be buying more land right now? Is that a good idea if the Fed's going to increase rates? If you're going to refinance, right now is the time to do it if you can get it done before they raise rates. So, but then the flip side you got to think about is if they're raising interest rates, that's encouraging people to save more because they can get a better rate of return on, savings and treasuries and things like that. So you got to think about it from that flip side of, yes, the cost of borrowing is going up, but also my return on savings and investing potentially is going to go up as well.
Do you see any difference between maybe the environment that we're in right now versus maybe everybody brings it back to the 80s? And even I think once the inflation number comes out, that price number comes out, they're like, this is the highest since 84 or 82. Do you see any difference in today's environment versus then?
Yeah. So I can't speak from real experience because I was not alive during the 1980s. However, no, I think, there's a lot of people coming out with thoughts on this, and we're definitely it's a different inflationary period. When we think about the causes of the 80s, in the 80s, there was a lot of, oil issues and the price of oil went up, and then also post Vietnam versus right now, when we think about what's causing inflation, it's just, we have so much liquidity in the market right now. The government pumped so much money into the economy because of COVID. And rightfully so, it needed to happen to make sure we weren't going to go into recession. So there's just so much liquidity in the market. I don't think any economist is not surprised that we're experiencing the level of inflation we are. When you think about all of the money that went out in government payments directly to individuals, or all of the loans that went out to small businesses in particular. I don't think anyone was really surprised that we're experiencing this level of inflation. I'll be really interested to see how the market will react once, the Fed raises interest rates, what that's going to do, to the farmland market in particular. We've seen, when we think about the 80s, that inflation was really early on in the 1980s, and then it was later in the 80s that we had the farm crisis. Typically, the agriculture industry and farmland in particular lags from the rest of the economy when it comes to those things. So I'll be really interested to see, what's going to happen with the farmland market within the next 12 months, 24 months, 36 months, and so on.
I'm not going to ask you to predict when, this inflation period is going to end, but what are some of the indicators that maybe you're going to keep an eye on as we move forward over the next 12, 24, 36 months to kind of see when this tide might start to turn?
Yeah. So obviously the big one is interest rates. So we've already been touching on that. So how the market's going to react with an interest rate hike and just how quickly it's going to react. Other things I'm going to be watching is supply chain issues. I think they're predicting that hopefully by the beginning of next year, our supply chain issues will hopefully be resolved. And I think that that's a huge cause for inflation right now. Some other things I'm watching is just some geopolitical risk in particular, depending on, no one's quite sure what Russia's going to do, when it comes to Ukraine, and that could have a huge impact, on trade and things like that, especially if China were to get involved as well as one of our largest exporting partners. So those are some big things that I'm watching. I think that geopolitical risk could be, a huge risk when it comes to, commodity prices in particular.
I'd be curious, as you're trying to keep a pulse on a lot of these things going on all across the world. Like, what's your kind of daily reading list look like? Because I think a lot of people just get overwhelmed in general when you hear the quick highlights of Russia, supply chain, this, that, and the other thing, and they're like, well, there's only 24 hours in a day and I'm only awake for 16 of them, kind of thing. Like, yeah. I mean, the first time, I don't know if you kind of set some time in the morning to go through, whether it's the Wall Street Journal, this, that, and the other thing, or the evening. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see what what's that list look like, or what you're kind of keeping tabs on?
Yeah. So I think the first thing I try to start with, and doesn't always happen, I am a Christian woman. And so I try to start with a daily devotional, just try to get my head right when it comes to all of this stuff in particular. And then I move on. The Wall Street Journal is a huge one for me. I get their alerts, notifications. I get a lowdown from them. They send me an email every morning about like the top 10 things that you should be watching. That is one. When it comes to the agriculture side, obviously I'm at the University of Illinois. And so Farm Doc is huge when it comes to, they put out just so much great information about agriculture, about commodity prices. Some other ones, I love to listen to Jim Cramer on Cnbc. He's just fun to listen to, especially his podcast. I grew up watching Squawk Box with my dad every morning. So that's another big one. I think, for me, it was really, when it comes to my just daily reading, I was really overwhelmed when I first started my professional career, because it just seemed like everybody always knew what was happening in the markets. And I'm like, how do you take in all of this information? And I think it's just spending, 10 minutes a day, 15 minutes a day, reading through headlines, reading through thinking about things from a global perspective and not just in, we as agriculturalists, it's really easy for us to just focus on what's going on in the agriculture space and really just looking at the broader picture because it all affects what we do. It all affects our returns.
Cool. And on some of that, I think sometimes you can, like, if you go a little beyond the headlines, or if you kind of go down a rabbit hole, if you will, sometimes it's hard to separate some of the noise versus some of the actual reporting. Do you separate the noise from that reporting by focusing on those emails, that the top 10 things with the Wall Street Journal, or quickly checking Farm Docs in the morning and not going too deep in it? Or
yeah, and I think I'm very lucky that, especially when it comes to, I worked a lot in this research space where I've been able to, see, overall, you think about the last 50 years and everyone gets all concerned about huge drops in the stock market, a daily drop in the stock market. And when you think, okay, but within the last 50 years, the returns to the stock market are around 8 to 10%. So everybody gets really, I think it's just not trying to take things, just trying to take things a little bit more lightly, and realizing that the market changes from day to day, and the world changes from day to day. And, I think it goes back to a lot of, my agriculture values. I was raised with a really level head about a lot of these things. I don't try to get too worked up about, headlines that occur. There's just, you're absolutely right. There's so much noise between news and social media and just all of those day-to-day things that influence our opinions on things. It's like really just staying true to your values, staying true to, what the knowledge base that you have is really, really crucial.
So that's a good note. Kind of on that stock market front in particular, just taking it in context. Like, there has been 2% drops in the stock market in the past. It's not the end of the world. Yeah. The sky is not falling. I would be curious, carrying on with the reading list, top 3 books that you might recommend folks. And it does not have to be the economic textbook that, Bruce Sherrick wrote or recommends. It can be anything from, Harry Potter to anything else.
Yeah, so I read a variety of different things. I read a lot of novels in particular. So when it comes to, just maybe my top favorite novel, so I love F. Scott Fitzgerald. He is actually, one of his short stories is where my parents got my name, Ailie. So that's where I love his reading. So The Great Gatsby is one of my favorites. It's a classic. And then some other ones I'm actually listening to right now. I'm listening to Am I Being Too Subtle by Sam Zell. So Sam Zell, Equity Group International, is a massive investor in this space, just really famous for his words of wisdom about risk and return. And he just keeps a really level head. And he just has some really fun anecdotal things about, the markets. And it goes back to that point of just not taking yourself too seriously, not taking life too seriously. And just really looking at the broader picture of what's important. So I'm listening to that book right now. He also narrates the book. which is, if you've never listened to him, I like really highly recommend going and listening to him. He's just got a really great sense of humor. He talks about how his family came over here right in the middle of World War II. He's Jewish, and how they were able to escape, Poland just right in the nick of time before it was invaded. And so he talks about the struggles that his family faced, which, as someone who grows up in the agriculture industry and recognizes how difficult farming was in particular for my father, my grandfather, my great grandfather. I really, that really resonates with me. Another book I just started that I would recommend, even though I haven't quite finished it yet, is The Psychology of Money. And it is just kind of talks about that behavioral finance aspect of things, about why people do what they do and why people spend on what they spend. I love thinking about that why. So that's another one that I would recommend for sure.
Cool. I did not know Sam Zell had a book out. Is that new or is that
2017, I think. So within the last 4 or 5 years.
Okay. And I totally agree, especially if you get it on audiobook. And if the author reads it, there's just this extra wow factor or something. I recently read Who is Michael Ovitz, who's the big Hollywood agent. So it's got it cool from a business perspective. And then it's also cool to just hear about some of the backroom dealings with some of our favorite movies from the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s that he worked on. He also obviously reads that. And it's a very, very good listen. Awesome. As we kind of wrap this up, I'd be interested, what are some of the things that you're focused on in 2022 and what folks should keep an eye on?
Yeah, I think, things I'm focused on in particular, I mean, we kind of already touched on this, but geopolitical risk, what's going to happen with Russia and China, and everything like that. I think that's just a huge thing that agriculturalists should be watching. If Russia were to invade Ukraine, and then subsequently, there's talk of if China were to invade Taiwan, what that could mean for us if there were any, trade embargoes put on China, since we export just a ton of our agricultural commodities. So that's something I'm really watching that's going to have a huge impact on prices, in particular in farmland returns. Another thing on the agriculture space I'm watching is just overall costs. I think, we've seen costs skyrocket for inputs, and fuel, labor, everything like that. So that's something I'm really watching closely. We've talked about interest rates already. So those are and then obviously as somebody interested in the farmland space, I'm just really interested to know what's going to happen with farmland values over the next year. There's a lot of speculation of, I think that farmland values will probably continue to rise over the next year, and not to the levels that we saw last year, but probably more in that 5 to 10% range, and then potentially level off. So those are kind of the big things that I'm watching.
Very cool. Well, we'll end on that note. It has been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, and folks will be able to read some more of your insights here on farmersrisk.ag as we move forward. So thank you so much for the time.
Thank you so much for having me, Nick. I appreciate it.